Hi, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on Eastern Mediterranean contributions to Middle East security, and a special thanks to the Middle East Forum, our programming partner for this chat. Since the discovery of natural gas almost 15 years ago in the East Med, we've seen this region come together in unexpected ways. Ties have expanded beyond Greece, Cyprus, and Israel to include a number of Middle Eastern countries, the US, the EU, and it moved well beyond energy into the security realm as well. This has taken on a new dimension in the post-October 7th Middle East, and as the Trump administration looks to approach this region. And I will tackle these issues today with Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, Gregg, the Executive Director of the Middle East Forum, Jonathan Spear, the Director of Research at the Middle East Forum, and Ian Lesser, Distinguished Fellow and Advisor to the President at the German Marshall Fund. Michael, I want to kick off with you here. For many, especially in the policymaking world, countries in the Eastern Mediterranean have either fallen in the Europe bracket, the Middle East, Africa, and this is notoriously true in different bureaus at the State Department, for example. This has changed over the past years with initiatives that Greece, Cyprus, and Israel have been spearheading. Can we talk about the Middle East today without looking at this broader region of the Eastern Med?
I don't think we can. When I used to teach for the Navy, I would show a map of all the military bases and facilities we had in the Persian Gulf, but the fact of the matter is the Eastern Mediterranean, for so many more reasons, is increasingly important in the 21st century. We have Suda Bay, now Alexandropolis, but the fact of the matter is, on board the US aircraft carriers and so forth, the Sixth Fleet is no longer just some place you transit through. It's actually the destination, both because of instability, and I mean, there's no better expert on Syria than Jonathan, who just came back from Syria and has had many, many trips there.
We'll definitely get into that.
Yeah, and also for good. I mean, the cooperation between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus has really reworked the strategic calculation. Now, in the United States right now, of course, certain things are upended, but the elephant in the room is Turkey. And even if the Trump administration doesn't deal with Turkey head on, even if Washington has a bad habit of calibrating our policy towards wishful thinking rather than the reality of what some countries have become, the fact of the matter is the Turkey problem isn't going to be wished away. And even if the Trump administration doesn't deal with it as directly right now, ultimately, we're going to need to deal with it, which makes that Israel-Greece-Cyprus partnership, which is truly bipartisan, even more important.
Gregg, I want to turn to you. What have the deepening ties across the East Med meant for the security of countries in the Middle East, particularly countries like Israel, which have one foot in the East Med and one in the Middle East?
Greece, in and of itself, is the democratic gateway for Middle Eastern countries, and especially Israel, by way of Cyprus, to become connected in the Euro-Med partnership. This is through the pipeline that was proposed, and hopefully will come back. This is through the electric interconnector. This is through joint defense treaties, the need for maritime patrols, and the ability to create a southern bulwark against Turkish aggression in the Eastern Mediterranean. But even more than Israel, you have connections now between Cyprus and Egypt and their joint pipeline products, especially in the ability to refine natural gas coming from Cypriot fields. But what I think is needed here is the realization, and I think it exists in Washington, that this alliance which is building, which has been largely based on strategic dialogue, on cooperation, on exercises like Noble Dina, Argonaut, and other examples, has to be solidified in a formal defense alliance and defense agreement between these three countries backed by the United States. And I think they're on their way to doing that. And insofar as Turkey is increasingly a threat, whether it be in Turkish-occupied Cyprus or through their hybrid warfare, their asymmetrical capabilities, or their building of their navy, it requires an even stronger response from Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, but also from Egypt and other Arab countries who have an interest in seeing Europe connected to the Middle East.
Ian, I want to turn to you because you've been closely watching the transatlantic relationship over the years, and as Greece and Cyprus lean into this East Med role, that's also bringing NATO and the European Union to the doorstep of the Middle East. What does this mean for the region?
Well, thanks. I mean, the point has already been made, and I absolutely agree that one of the hallmarks of this region is that it's the nexus of both the Middle Eastern and the European security environments. In fact, beyond that too, if you think of things like IMEC now and the connections with India and the routes to the Red Sea and so forth, the protection of infrastructure, all of these, it's a multi-regional problem. But clearly, I mean, there was a discussion earlier today in this room about some of this, and then there was a question asked at the end by an Egyptian colleague, well, why didn't you mention the Med? Why didn't you mention the South in this context? In fact, we talked a little bit about it, but I think there's a hugely important question here. I mean, if the United States is going to be less present in European security on the continent in the future, it doesn't necessarily follow that the United States is going to be less present in this region. I think for all the reasons that have already been mentioned, there's a very strong logic for the United States remaining engaged in different ways, politically, militarily, economically, in terms of energy investment and many, many other things. I do think the U.S., I mean, I know we'll talk more about Turkey, but the U.S. will be a stakeholder in this détente that has been off again, on again over decades between Greece and Turkey. I mean, if you don't assume that, you have a big problem. You have a big problem for the EU above all, but also for NATO. And we could say more about that. Just one final point, just to appreciate how much, NATO has had to reinvent its presence in the East in many, many ways. It may have to reinvent it again now. In the South, the NATO has a lot of assets. It has infrastructure, it has presence, it has command structure, it has all of these things. There's nothing to be reinvented. And even just to take one final example, most of the ballistic missile defense in Europe, in and around Europe, is actually afloat in the Mediterranean. And that's a reality that is unlikely to change.
Michael, I'm just going to jump in on what Ian said, and I largely agree with it. Again, when I used to teach for the Navy, the fact of the matter is the U.S. has a base in Rota, Spain, outside the Strait of Gibraltar. But beyond that, our facilities are basically Ceuta Bay. Naples is much more administrative, and then we have Alexandropolis, which is logistical. But on top of that, it's not that simply the United States is looking at a map and saying, hey, look, the Eastern Mediterranean is important. You have facilities like Cyclops in Cyprus, where Cyprus has basically made itself indispensable with that facility in terms of port security, airport security, chemical, biological, radiological, weapon detection, and so forth. It's been able to leverage its position as one of the only trusted partners in the region by all the different factions and countries in the region. The fact of the matter is, one of the reasons why the Eastern Mediterranean is so important isn't simply strategic. It's not simply because it's on the fault lines. It's because of the foresight, especially in Cyprus, of making itself indispensable to the region. And we recognize Cyprus as a partner because of what Cyprus can bring to us, not because it's simply one more chit in some amorphous game board.
Jonathan, I want to bring you into this discussion because one of the things that countries in the region, when we look at the security dimension, have to deal with isn't, just states that may be threatening, malign actors like Russia, Turkey, which you've brought up, that could be problematic for the region, but it's also non-state actors, and we see, terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah operating in the region. In Syria, there are non-state actors that are extremely problematic. How do you see the growing East Med diplomacy contributing to the fight against, terror, for example?
Yes, well, I think that you can already see the fruits of this, actually. I mean, in terms of the existing cooperation that appears to exist between Israel and Cyprus and Greece. Simply, if you look at the publicly available track record of terror attacks, which have been successfully intercepted, or attempted terror attacks which have been successfully intercepted over the last couple of years. We remember in June 2023, a very serious attack planned on a Jewish and Israeli sites in Cyprus, intercepted and frustrated in October of the same year. Once again, I think two Iranian citizens who were attempting to come in Cyprus from the occupied side down to Cyprus and were then arrested. So also, I think at the same time period, 7 Pakistani nationals operating for Iran arrested in Greece. These are not successes which come out of nowhere. They come out of an apparently existing process of cooperation between the relevant bodies of the three countries. And I think this is something which is to be noted and I would think to be applauded also. I think that has also brought with it new experiences, if I can put it that way, for Cyprus and maybe for Greece also, in the sense that we remember in June 2024, I think for the first time, an open threat from Lebanese Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah of violence against Cyprus. So the cooperation and the growing relations between the sides have benefits, but they're also bringing parties to that process into the sights, so to speak, of hostile actors. And this is something which I think also needs to be borne in mind. I think there's an additional point to be made with all this, which is I would like to, in a certain sense, complicate the definition we give of sort of non-state actors, because actually many or most of the terrorism which we are noting in our region today is no longer committed by or perpetrated by purely non-state actors. Rather, what we are seeing, the kind of the birth of what we are seeing is ostensible non-state actors who actually are operating on behalf of this or that state. This arguably in our region was a practice patented or launched by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And if we think about the examples I'm given, Hezbollah and Iranians operating together to carry out terror attacks is an example of it. But we should also note, if we're thinking about assessing threats in this area, that in two of these occasions, the perpetrators came down from occupied side of Cyprus, from Turkish-controlled northern Cyprus. That is to say, the Iranians may have pioneered the practice of using non-state actors, violent non-state actors, for state purposes, but they're not the only ones that are in that game. The Turks are in that game as well, and this is something which we need to pay close attention to.
Yeah, Gregg, do you want to chime in on this? Because I know this is something you follow closely, especially the dynamics that we see play out in Syria, dynamics with Hamas. How drastic has the shift been since October 7th when we talk about dealing with,
Turkey is the equivalent of hosting Sunni terror groups as much as Iran is the host to Shia and other Sunni terror groups. But it's not just the violent actors that we have to worry about. It's the influence operations that are promulgated, planned, and then launched against the West and Eastern Mediterranean countries and even Middle Eastern countries that start in Istanbul and Ankara. If you think about the home of the most vile terror organization that Israel considers, Hamas, murders were planned in Istanbul and carried out in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Israel proper. If you think about the support that Turkey has given to Syrian militias, the groups that killed thousands of Alawis in Latakia and in Tartus were backed by the Turkish government. They were proxies of Turkey. If you think about the operations, the human wave assaults, the migration assaults, by Turkey turning on the equivalent of a spigot and allowing tens of thousands of individuals to flow across the Turkish border from the Bosphorus and into Europe, Erdogan has control of that. And they use these mechanisms as ways in which to put pressure on Europe, and even trying to bribe and influence the mayor of New York City and have the largest Islamist institution in the United States in Virginia, which is not in the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's indicative of what they're willing to do, the lengths of how far they're willing to go in order to get what they want. And the only hedge, the only shield, the only vanguard against that is this tripartite alliance with the backing of the United States, NATO, and the European Union. And it has to be strengthened, and it has to be made that it's not just acting against Turkey defensively, but it's creating an alternate infrastructure to make sure that Turkey cannot continue with both the support of violent proxies and asymmetrical warfare against West and the ideals that we hold as Western liberal democratic countries.
I'm just going to chime in here. There's another analogy I think of when I think of Erdogan. I agree with Gregg that he is as extremist on the Sunni side as the Islamic Republic of Iran is on the Shia side. But I'm also reminded of the history of negotiations with Yasser Arafat, the wishful thinking that was involved in them. And what the West, both the United States and Europe, didn't fully recognize is while Yasser Arafat sometimes said the right thing, he was much more interested in the process than the peace. And specifically, he was much more interested in cashing in chits and having immunity from his actions for fear that it would somehow disrupt diplomacy. What we see with Recep Tayyip Erdogan today is two things. Number one is the sense that we can't hold him to account because We need him as an intermediary with Russia and Ukraine, with the United States and Iran, with whatever. That's the problem in Washington. But there's also a problem in Europe. And that is this notion that when we need to appease bigger countries, that we can force smaller democracies, Cyprus, for example, into concessions which are ill-conceived and ultimately extremely destructive, especially when the protagonist, Erdogan in this case, isn't sincere about peace in the first place. Cyprus should not have to pay the price for Turkish malfeasance.
Ian, I want to pull you in here because you've worked on obviously this region, but also Turkey closely. We just saw President Trump recently during his meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu talk about how close his relationship is with Erdogan. How do you see the U.S. role here vis-a-vis Turkey now?
The American relationship with Turkey across multiple administrations has always been difficult. I mean, it's never been easy. I mean, there's never been any golden age in this. Arguably, it was maybe at its best in a way under the Clinton administration, but that was difficult enough. I was in the administration then, looking at that account. That was not easy. It will never be easy. But there is a fundamental difference, to go back to your earlier point about the transatlantic aspect here, between the American relationship with Turkey and the European one. At some level, the American and Turkish relationship is optional, actually. Even though the Turks don't like to think of it that way, it can be optional. With Turkey, it's not, and the European Union, it's not optional. They can't get away from each other. There's a diaspora, there's a big economic relationship, there's the migration issue. There are a whole set of things. Even if Turkey is not converging with Europe as many had hoped, there are still these aspects to the relationship that you can't escape. The other thing, of course, is that NATO is the place where Turkey has a seat at the table. That matters a lot to them, actually. It actually matters a lot to them. There really has been only one direct military clash in recent years between a NATO ally and Russia, and it was with Turkey and Russia. That could easily have turned out differently. If it were to happen today, it might easily turn out differently. And so, it's not, there is the West, if you want to use that term, has some leverage with Ankara, and I think a lot of it goes back to this fundamental insecurity that Turkey feels in its region, for reasons some of its own creation, some not, where NATO is a key hedge. And that's not going to change.
Jonathan, I want to get your take here too. What do you make of whatever U.S. response we might see moving forward, especially given what we've heard from President Trump in the last days on Erdogan?
Say it again. I didn't understand the question.
What do you make of what the U.S. response could be moving forward, especially when it comes to Turkey and its dealings with groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, especially after what we've heard from President Trump?
Well, I mean, in a sense, this is a mystery to me, and I think it's a mystery to many people in the room, probably, namely the nature of President Trump's, or the reasons behind President Trump's response, or response pattern, if I can put it that way, with regard to Turkey. That's to say, it seems to me, in terms of the evidence available, very obvious that Turkey is set on a very aggressive path and a very aggressive strategy across a very, very broad swathe of territory, starting in Libya and going across the Eastern Mediterranean and going across Israel, West Bank and Gaza, and up to Syria and up to Iraq, and maybe a little bit beyond as well. So across a very, very broad swathe of territory, what you have is a Turkish government bent on rapid and radical change, leading to an emergence of its own hegemony through practices which hit at a number of available norms. And I would say most specifically, and I hinted at this in my first comment, most specifically and maybe most interestingly, the employment of semi-state paramilitary actors as servants of Turkish policy. And we think of that, and Gregg mentioned it in terms of the use of the mobilization of Syrian Islamist paramilitary organizations, up to and including the recent commission of atrocities, as Gregg mentioned, in Latakia and Tartus. And we see a similar employment of forces of that kind, by the way, also in Libya, and we also saw it in Azerbaijan. So there is a certain sense in which Turkey is embarked on a very, very radical strategy intended to rapidly and radically shift the strategic balance across a broad swathe of territory in its own interests. And it does remain, I must say for me, something of a mystery why the existence of that strategy and the danger that it represents does not appear to be apparent to the people currently guiding US policy and strategy. And as a result, we're seeing the kind of quite strange, in my humble opinion, as a concerned citizen, expressions used. For example, in the recent press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, in which Netanyahu is told, well, you know, Erdogan's a good guy and he's a tough guy and you have to sort things out with him. I find all this very strange. I find that this goes against the available evidence that the current dispensation or government in Turkey is embarked on a very, very radical path indeed, which it would seem to me it's in the interest of the United States and its allies to try to contain.
I know, Ian, you want to chime in real quick, and then Greg.
This, I mean, I think the kind of, the discourse that you're just talking about, it just shows us how brittle, how fragile, how changeable this relationship could actually be. I mean, if it's really based on the kind of personal dynamics, and I think that is very much the way President Trump sees the world, that's very changeable, potentially. I think, look, there's a lot at stake there. If the normal balance between the executive and Congress was acting at the moment, this would probably be a different conversation, because in Congress, Turkey, as we know, has very few friends. The strategic constituency for the relationship has essentially collapsed in recent years, especially in Congress, but not just. And what is it hanging on? It's hanging on this personal thing that we're all assuming between Trump and Erdogan. And it may be different next week, to be honest with you. And think of the implications of that when, the United States has Incirlik Air Base as well, of course. There are nuclear weapons sitting in Incirlik Air Base. I mean, this is actually serious stuff, but it could change next week.
Greg?
I think that there is an analysis that has to be done, an argument that has to be had in Washington, D.C., looking at the Trump administration's foreign policy priorities and its domestic priorities, and we have to just look back to 2018 and 2019 to see when Erdogan pushed too far. And fool me twice, it's going to be shame on him. Okay? He threatens Middle Eastern Christian communities. He's being detrimental to Greek Orthodox, to Syriac Orthodox, to others that are in the Eastern Mediterranean bent. He is threatening Egypt insofar as it relates to, and these are just allies' interests. Forget about trying to create a Turkish air defense mechanism over the skies of Syria. But you have American companies like Chevron, ExxonMobil, and other energy that Trump is key, considering them as a key constituency. And Erdogan's moves, especially as it relates to the Turkish-Libya exclusive economic zone agreement, is directly anathema to American energy companies' interests, trying to give business to companies that have no business doing there. And if you just stack everything up and you make the case wherein Trump thinks that he has a personal relationship with the dictator in Ankara, and you show that, yes, he may have a good personal relationship, but in terms of the interests of the United States and the case to be made to the State Department and to his others advisors, I think Erdogan will push too far, that relationship will fray, and he will do himself in. So I say, you can have whatever rhetorical flourishes you want, you can listen to whatever they're saying as it relates to press conferences, but where the rubber meets the road, my hope, if organizations like ours, the Middle East Forum, do our job, we can educate the president and his staff as relates to the true threat that Erdogan doesn't just present to Greece, Cyprus, and Israel and other regional actors, but also the threat that Erdogan presents to U.S. national security and economic interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. And if that case is made, then I think that relationship might start to break apart.
There's actually an old Russian joke about the difference between a pessimist and an optimist. The Russian pessimist is the one who said, things have never been so bad. War, economy, health, environment couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who said, no, they can always get worse. So I'm going to give a little bit of an optimistic take here right now. Everything Greg said is true, but I'm actually worried that something worse is to come. When we talk about NATO and Turkey's role in NATO, sometimes we talk about Turkey as a Trojan horse. I worry much more that Turkey is using NATO as a shield. That when we look at the nuclear power plant, the Russian-built nuclear power plant coming online this year in Akuyunlu, could that be used as a as a mechanism for Russia to import, for Turkey to import nuclear goods for a covert program. I'm not saying Al-Qayunlu is part of a covert program, but what the Iranian strategy was initially was to use the civilian nuclear reactor at Bushehr as cover to provide, to allow for imports of goods for their covert. Now, the difference between Iran and Turkey is that Iran, of course, is not in NATO. Iraq wasn't in NATO with the Osirak reactor. Syria wasn't in NATO when it came to the plutonium processing plant at Deir ez-Zor, both of which were taken out. But Turkey can hide behind the shield of Article 5 while building up a nuclear program, which would be a danger to Europe, a danger to Israel, and a danger, frankly, to many of the Arab states in the Middle East. I do think we need to worry about not just the problems that Turkey poses today, but the problems it's going to pose 5 or 10 years from now. And the problem with the Trump administration is that Erdogan is playing Trump like a fiddle, playing for time, and the question is, what happens during the next 4 years, and how much of that can be reversed?
Can I give you another path to that, what you're describing? And the path is slightly different. It's what we were discussing in this room earlier today. It's that the US withdraws, becomes dysfunctional in NATO, however you want to say. I mean, I'm not predicting this. I'm just putting this out as a scenario. That you have a more European NATO, a much more European NATO without the United States. How do you have a significant nuclear deterrent as part of that? Well, you may find that other countries in Europe simply go nuclear. Other NATO members go nuclear. Poland, Sweden. You know, the list can go on. Under those conditions, the idea of Turkey developing its own program looks rather different. And I mean, that's another path, you know, maybe an easier one in some sense to the kind of scenario you're describing.
The difference is, of course, Turkey is occupying 3 countries right now, whereas Sweden is not. I mean,
no. I'm not trying to make
I know
it
you're not. I'm not
into
trying
a
to put
good
words in your
situation. I mean, I'm just saying it's another path.
Yeah, your analysis is valid. I agree.
Yeah. So, you know, the challenge posed by Turkey obviously is one that we're well aware of. But another thing that I want to focus on that's linked, but also something that could be turned into a great, you know, winning story in the East Med is that of the Great Sea Interconnector. And it's something that's on the top of the mind here in Greece, in Cyprus, and I'm sure in Israel too, because, you know, Cyprus and Israel are energy islands. And this grid that would go from Greece to Cyprus to Israel would be transformative for them. How do you see this factoring into the broader discussion about, you know, East Med contributions to Middle East security? And I know, Greg, I'll give you a first stab at this.
Sure. So there's a process going on right now, both in the US Congress and the European Parliament, and also amongst private sector, not just with the IMEC, but also with some of the infrastructure projects which are between Cyprus, Greece, and Israel, to be able to create a framework to provide a permanent security solution for these different projects which literally connect the 3 countries, turning an island into an archipelago which is able to basically be able to deal with one another. In the realm of gas and the pipeline, Euromed, it has to get back. And there's emphasis from the United States to actually perhaps underwrite that. There's a bill right now in the US Congress which will underwrite and subsidize cybersecurity cooperation and other sort of electronic warfare means to be able to directly confront any threats to infrastructure which is built under this, which is right now under consideration in the House of Representatives. Beyond that, there's also the interconnector. And I think that as long as Greece and Cyprus are able to make some minor financial adjustments and to be able to agree to a point here, Israel is ready to provide security for the eastern side of that, the eastern side going from Cyprus to Israel, but also there is a desire right now for the Israeli Prime Minister to visit Athens along with his Greek and Cypriot counterparts to be able to create a strategic dialogue to address any issues where Israel might be able to do its part to secure the western flank of the interconnector. It is improving its navy, it is improving its submarine forces, it is willing to participate both in aerial exercises and even perhaps have a permanent placement of Israeli forces in Cyprus or in Greece, rather than just doing it temporarily through different exercises. And the word coming out of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and perhaps the ambassador will confirm, deny, or just not address it at all in this conference, is that Israel will do what it must to make it easier for Greece and Cyprus to connect the 3 countries together. So I think that you really have momentum on this. Turkey's trying to stop it, but Israel's ready to play ball if Greece and Cyprus will do what it takes.
Very quickly, the advantage of this also is the more that Israel and Greece cooperate in this sort of way, the more that Israel can take the lead on some issues of Eastern Med maritime security, the more then Greece can counter challenges it faces from Turkey in the Aegean. But if Greece is forced to face the challenges across the Mediterranean and in the Aegean, the Hellenic navy will be spread too thin. This is where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts if Cyprus, Greece, and Israel truly cooperate in the way that Gregg describes.
Jonathan, what's your take here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add really the sense of real urgency to this discussion. People need to understand that when we're talking about the need for, in this case, a greater, and I agree entirely, the need for a greater Israeli underwriting in security terms to the project of the Great Sea Interconnector, we should understand that there are also hostile eyes upon that project, which are active. That's to say that what was discussed earlier, the Turkish-Libyan exclusive economic zone declared in November 2019, directly bisects this project. And as we were discussing with friends earlier today, there is already evidence of active Turkish efforts to disrupt the process of laying the interconnector, and we can assume these will increase. So this is a moment of great urgency. And if I may add to that, slightly broadening the perspective, it seems to me that when we talk about the Great Sea Interconnector, or we talk about the East Med pipeline, or the various processes of trilateral cooperation between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, we should remember that we are talking also about the western edge of a much larger process, which in my estimation at least also takes in the Abraham Accords, and I think most specifically and importantly the relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and it also takes in the IMEC project or notion, the idea of the India, Mideast, European corridor. That's to say, these are all building blocks of, I think, a hoped for or intended for emergent strategic and economic alliance, which is, earlier today in one of the sessions, people were saying, well, we know that a global strategic order has come to an end. We don't know what the new one's going to look like. And I agree with that. But I think looking at the Middle East, we can already see the outlines of what, at least if Israel, Greece, and Cyprus have our way, so to speak, an emergent new strategic and economic reality will look like, based on these interlocking projects going all the way from Greece across to Cyprus and Israel and the Gulf, and across eventually to India. Now, this is all currently in emergent form, but the direction of events and the direction of desired events is very clear, and we should be aware that there is a directly opposing will in this regard, which also has its own projects and its own methods, which is seeking to directly cut at and bisect the projects we're talking about here.
Ian, do you think that there is a sense of urgency in Brussels around projects like this? Because there definitely is in capitals like Athens, Nicosia, and Jerusalem.
I think Brussels is distracted by so many things at the moment that this isn't at the top of the list. And that said, there's a subset of people who do focus on this. Mm-hmm. They talk about IMEC, they talk about connectivity. Actually, it's the kind of thing the European institutions like to talk about. They're much more comfortable talking about connectivity than they are talking about defense investment, even though you have to do that, obviously. So, a sense of urgency, I think there's a sense of strong interest, but, people have to put up the money for it, too. A couple of years ago, people were wondering about where all that, sort of global gateway money, where was that actually coming from? What was it actually? People are now asking much bigger questions about all the defense investment that's going to be required. So, as much as it's valuable, I'm afraid it may get overtaken by other things. It won't go off the agenda, but it's not at the top.
We've got 2 minutes left, so I want to ask a question that can go out for everybody. Looking ahead, what's one area where you think we really need to be paying attention to when it comes to East Med security as it relates to the Middle East? Michael, you want to take the first stab here, and then we'll go down the line?
Turkish development of nuclear weapons capability, number one. Number two, we need to dispatch with this notion that Turkey will revert to the status quo ante after Erdogan goes. You've had more than 35 million Turks educated under Erdogan. You've had the bureaucracy and the military remade under his image, and you have a path to power which he's defined. And so we're going to be living with Erdoganism for at least 1 or 2 generations after Erdogan himself leaves.
Gregg?
I think it's really the strength, both diplomatic, security, and economic, of the 3+1 agreement to act as the antidote to Erdogan's neo-Ottomanism. It is not just about the security of these three countries and the United States backing it. It's also about creating hope and the ability for other actors in the Middle East to see that they don't just have to rely on Turkey for their trade routes with Europe. There is an alternate route, and it goes through those three countries. It's been shown in energy, it's coming forward in electricity, it can be forward in trade and logistics, and you don't have to go through Turkey if you're a Middle Eastern country if you want to do business with Europe. There is another way, and that way is the countries we've spoken about.
Jonathan?
Well, I would just like to suggest that all of us, when we look at Syria and we look at the current events in Syria, remember that the arrival of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to Damascus on December 8th of last year represented many things, but it also represented a strategic triumph for Turkey and for Erdogan. This was the result of a long investment by the Turks, in which they departed very widely from conventional wisdom. The Europeans, in the form of Mrs. Meloni, had already accepted that Assad was the winner. The Arab countries, to a great extent, in the form of UAE and others, Bahrain and others, had already accepted that Assad was the winner. And they looked at Erdogan and said, what are you doing? Why are you keeping this strange little enclave in northwest Syria, this dusty enclave, training up these jihadis? What's the point? Don't you understand that it's over and you're on the wrong side of history, or whatever the phrase is? Well, Erdogan didn't think so, and it turned out that he was right. And what has arrived into Damascus is a Turkish triumph, and what is currently being built is a Turkish Islamist Syria. And we already heard in January of this year a plan for another exclusive economic zone agreement in the Eastern Mediterranean between Turkey and the new government, its new client government in Damascus. So I would say when we're looking at events in Syria, keep very close watch on that and understand that currently the force that is rising in Syria is not just Ahmed Shara and HTS, it also behind that the forces of Turkey itself.
Ian, the last word is yours here.
Yeah, just two things that haven't been mentioned, and I'll just leave them there on the table. I mean, one is, the Turkish and other stakes in reconstruction in Lebanon and Syria, the commercial stakes in it. Not to say more. The other is migration. Our friend from the BND in the earlier session talked about that. It's a huge one.
Thank you all. Our time is up. But stay in your seats because we have an upcoming panel, Lessons from Thucydides on Strategic Competition, with Dr. Athanasios Platias and Andrew Novo. Thank you.
Thank you.